As Martha said, I work with the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative, and that's an organization that's been around since 1959. And we're going to show some images, and I think you and I are going to have a bit of a conversation while this happens,
Right.
and we invite questions, certainly. Not only do we operate a studio facility and other corporate operations in Cape Dorset that generate revenue, we also at the end of the year take that revenue and feed it back into the community as dividend. It's a very interesting model and one that the community has ownership over and benefits from in the end. The reason we exist was to create art. And James Houston, we'll see a little bit more about James Houston later on in the presentation, but James Houston was asked by the Canadian government to develop a source of economy for the individuals in Cape Dorset. This is long before anybody thought that art was possible. After research and contemplation, James decided that if you can imagine that art was the thing that this community would be built on. And since 1959, we have developed a print collection, and this is probably the most important and best known thing that we've been doing consistently since 1959 for 60 years. And this is one of the prints from that first collection. It's Canoe Ashevak, rabbit-eating seaweed, and it is a sealskin stencil, and it's exactly what it sounds like. The image has been cut out of sealskin and using a Japanese brush, the ink applied to the paper. I have this sitting next to my desk at the Toronto office, and I was shocked to find out one afternoon when I was reading the paper that this print sold for $75,000 Canadian at auction. It retailed in 1959 for, I think, $30.
Yeah.
So that's incredible appreciation. So
Yeah.
I think when I retire from this job,
yeah. Maybe we can just mention something about James Houston did a trip in the 50s to Japan to learn the technique from the Japanese. Now, of course, the Japanese use wood to make wood prints. So you have to transfer that knowledge to the material available in the north, which is, at this time, sealskin.
And strangely enough, if you think about it, the sealskin is the one element, but to your point about woodcut, if you can imagine, James comes back, he says, well, they're doing these great things with wood. Well, you're above the tree line in Cape Dorset. So someone said, why don't we use stone? So if you can imagine creating a matrix out of stone that you print from onto paper. So, I mean, on one hand, most of it was introduced to the community from the south, and other moments and elements were adapted from what was available in the community. So it's really an interesting synthesis since the very beginning. And just to show, this is the first logo for the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative. We still don't know who designed it. It was one of the artists. And then when one of the early managers came into the role, he decided it was too angular. So they changed it to something a little softer. And part of the reason that I'm here is because of what this logo represents. This is the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative 60th anniversary. 2019 is 60 years of operation, which is kind of incredible when you think about it. And again, continuously operated studio in Cape Dorset to essentially fuel the economy through the art market. Cape Dorset, now I think you mentioned earlier that there isn't a map. So what I'll do is just kind of give you a sense of what a fly-in community in the Arctic looks like. This is not my photograph. It is from the pilot on one of the flights that I said, can you please use your iPhone? Carefully, please pilot the plane. Don't get distracted with the photographs. But this is what the runway, you'll see it in the very middle of the runway, looks like approaching Dorset. There is no road into Dorset, and it's on an island. So not only do people have to be transported there, so does everything else that comes to the community, whether it's mail, whether it's medicine, whether it's food. This is a typical plane that you would take to Cape Dorset. Usually the front of the plane is packed with cargo, and there are very few seats for people in the back. So you can see the priority is, of course, fruits and vegetables, and not the people. Cape Dorset really hasn't changed a lot. I go up relatively frequently. I think last year I was there for about collectively 3 months out of the year, and so that's a long time when you think about it to be in the Arctic, and from someone who certainly didn't spend a lot of time in the Arctic before these trips. So this is a shot of the Cape Dorset community from the 50s. That's the Cape Dorset community, the same angle from today. So you can see things have changed a little bit, but the scale of the community is still very much the same. And part of the reason for that is, and I mentioned earlier, everything has to be transported. Building supplies have to be transported. You can't build the way you can build in the South. And so things have to stay a particular scale for those reasons. Just thought I would give you a little bit of a nostalgic walk through Cape Dorset. This is a family of the Inuit accepting packages that have come from the sea lift. So when you're not bringing things in on a plane, there are certain things like refrigerators. I think that large box is a refrigerator, or skidoos, or automobiles. These things have to be brought on a sea lift, which is a very, very large, massive, like a cargo ship. And so these things arrive, and these boxes end up getting taken to the shore and lifted into place by these backloads. It's an incredible operation, and you can imagine that there's probably only 2 weeks out of every year, a little longer now with climate change, about 2 weeks out of every year when you can actually get a boat as close to shore as you need to be because of ice. So it is such a complex operation. And there are a number of storage facilities around Dorset because, as you might imagine, when you only have a period of time, 2 weeks a year, to bring certain items in, you have to stockpile these items in case you need them. And it's interesting, I was talking to someone who said, oh, I can't, my meeting has to end now because I've got to go take my car to the dump. As you're taking your car to the dump, what happened? Well, the axle broke. I said, well, can't you just get the axle fixed? He goes, it's much cheaper to throw the car away and bring another one than to get it fixed. And so it becomes reality when simple things that we imagine, take your car to an auto shop and have it repaired. It doesn't exist in the North. So again, it's arduous, it's complicated, it is very challenging. As I was mentioning, these stockpiling of things, you can see they're the green and white Arctic cat containers. Those are snow machines. So as people need snow machines, they can purchase them and they're kept in storage. The rest of it is foodstuffs. So things that are non-perishable stay in storage all year long. One of the biggest things that the community consumes is Coca-Cola. So there are stockpiles of Coca-Cola. It is unreal.
Do you know how much a bottle of Coca-Cola costs?
It was, if you were to buy, I think I can remember, if you were to buy a package of 12 cans, it's probably in the vicinity of 35 Canadian dollars. And this would be something that would probably be in the vicinity of $5 in the South, like it is enormous. Yeah. And we've also seen, if you Google this, you'll see images of containers of orange juice for $30.
Right.
You'll see something like diapers, for instance, which you would assume is a requirement. If you have children, you need diapers. Diapers are $75 a package. You can imagine. So this gives you a sense. This is the back of the grocery store. There are 2 grocery stores in Cape Dorset. This is the grocery store that my organization owns.
I don't know the route of the Northwest Passage ships, but I was just at a conference in Tromsø, and there's been talking about limiting the size of the cruise ships that go through the Arctic, and this is a perfect example. Should something happen, an emergency situation happen for a cruise ship, they are relying on the community for help. And you take a look at the community, their situation. So how important it is to, when you're doing something, to think about the community first before thinking about that great adventure that one might want to make.
Precisely. I think the accommodation can handle 42 people. So this puts it in perspective, the lack of infrastructure. There isn't a restaurant, there's no cafe. Yeah. And in fact, I've had the most absurd circumstances where, we will bring delegates to Dorset, usually patrons of the arts or collectors who want to see where this work comes from. And the first thing they'll ask me is, can you send me a selection of hotels where I can stay? I say, well, there's a tent, and there's a tent, and can you please tell me, is there an advanced menu that I may see? An advanced menu, it's, whatever happened to get in there on the plane. So it is really otherworldly for people who aren't prepared for this. It's interesting, as I mentioned, a lot hasn't changed in Cape Dorset, and in fact, this is from the 50s. a school teacher taking some Inuit children to school. If I stand long enough in the window of my apartment in Cape Dorset, I see this every day. It is pretty remarkable. And speaking of apartments, this again is from the 50s. This is, and this was government housing. The territory of Nunavut, now, the territory of Nunavut's only existed for almost 20 years. 20 years this year, actually. 20 years. So this would have been when it was the Northwest Territories, but all of the land is owned by the territory. So all of this is government housing. And so all of these spaces look very much the same. So this is a typical home from the 1950s. That's my apartment. It doesn't actually look that different when you think about it. Not a lot of progress. Although I found it quite strange, this is my bedroom, and there is inexplicably a Danish modern cabinet that found its way to the Arctic. And so there are some comforts in Cape Dorset. That is the exterior of the apartment, just to give you a sense of the kind of architecture. It's aluminum cladding, and again, it needs to be because of the climate, because of the inability to bring certain materials to the concrete's just impossible. It's just too heavy. You know, bricks are impossible. They're just too heavy. So this is kind of the modern life in Dorset, and there are some throwbacks to what the Inuit used to do. And this is the spinal cord of a bowhead whale. And I'm so sorry that there's not a point of reference to give you size, but these are massive. This is a massive, massive thing. I wasn't there and I think it was probably 5 years ago when they harvested this whale. And they would harpoon the whale, they dragged it to shore, they brought a big truck in, they dragged the carcass onto to the beach, and people just ran with plastic bags and containers and just, you know, tearing the meat off of the whale. And, you know, and this is it's once every 5 years or even more that the community will finally be able to have the same sort of experience that they've been having for millennia, surviving off of the land and with country food, as they call it.
And I just want to make a reference to the whalebone sculptures that we have. It's not that I'm not cleaning all the time, but there's sand always still coming out of the sculptures. And that's because that's where the whalebone has been taken for the carvings. That bone will stay a long time on the beach, being cured in a sense, before carving will be made of it. Because if you want to compare the whalebone to wood, you can. You don't want to use fresh wood to do a carving because it will just, you know, explode at one point or another. And it's the same thing with whalebone and with walrus tusk. And that's why the artists have patience before they use it, so that something sustainable will be made of it. Yeah,
and you're right about the curing. As far as I understand it, the skeletal remains are so oily that they need to somehow dry, and it takes an extended period of time. And occasionally the little ones will be a little bit drier than others. So you'll see people harvesting some of the smaller ones, but the larger ones, which can be massive, as you can see, need to stay for extended periods of time in order to cure. And there's a real sense of community in Cape Dorset. And something like this, you know, where a community comes out to harvest traditional food, but also during Nunavut Day, and so this is a group of people for a celebration in Nunavut Day, which happens in July, and I was the judging the best Nunavut Day costume here. And so this little guy won. I think he was the only one in the category of toddler, but...
When I was there for Nunavut Day, it was Ning TV one, because she had this beautiful amatuk, beautifully beaded, everything done by herself. We'll hear more about Ning TV as time goes on, but they have sailboat races. That means you build your own little model sailboat across the lake. There's different games. There's also a parade, which is made up of the fire trucks, right? It's a big celebration. Now, one has to remember that Nunavut was founded on the 1st of April in 1995.
1999.
Excuse me, yeah. They've been working on it for a while. Right, so but you can imagine the weather on the 1st of April, and that's why it's being celebrated in the summertime. Yeah.
This is, and you know, I experience it when I'm there. The community gets together, as you've just mentioned. You know, community feasts where they bring in caribou and seal, and you've never seen anything like it. When
Geese.
they drag in a few seal, they drag in a few caribou carcass. Everybody takes out a traditional ulu, which I think you have some here, the arced knife, and they just sort of hack apart the seal. And you know, my first trip to Cape Dorset, there was a community feast. Of course, they hand me a plate with this bloodied seal on it. So what am I supposed to do? They said, eat it. Talk about, what is the term, baptism by fire? Now, I should use the term fire. There's lots of community excitement, lots of things that are so special about Cape Dorset, but there are so many things that are challenging. And this is not my photograph, but this is a photograph from the RCMP officer who was on an elevated part of town. This is the high school on fire. There were some children playing with gasoline and matches, if you can imagine, a terrible combination, and they lit the school on fire. There is one fire truck. The fire truck, there is no plumbing, so the fire truck has to go back to a source of water and come back. So each time it goes away, the fire just, you know, continues to grow, and it's hard to manage it. So this was at the height of the fire. The high school was the largest and most technologically advanced building in town. It burnt to the ground. And if you remember, I was mentioning that things need to be brought to Cape Dorset only once a year for 2-week periods, that it's complicated to build. Well, you can imagine losing a facility like this, what it did to the community. These are my photographs. I was there 3 days after the fire was extinguished. And you imagine the devastation. This wasn't just the high school. This was also the daycare. This was the community kitchen. This was the gymnasium where all of the athletic activities happened. So you can imagine when someone described it to me as, we've lost a family member in this building, you know, and literally it was such an epicenter that they felt it was part of the family. And so the difficulty also with this is it held all the communication servers. So for 3 days, I couldn't get an email or a phone call into Cape Dorset. So you can imagine. It wasn't until we saw it on the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation that we knew what was happening.
And Kurt has a question.
When was it? Which year?
This was 4 years ago now.
4 years ago?
4 years ago.
50.
Yeah, this is very recent. They've rebuilt the school since, and the reason they rebuilt the school, this is a tiny building, and it's the grade school, and the kids had to share the building. So you imagine, Cape Dorset, I think, has 40% of 1,400 people are under the age of 16. So you imagine how many children there are in the school. It was bursting with all of and you could see these kids, you know, in the little desks, like the high school students in the little desks, you know, until they brought the big desks on a sea lift. So it was such a profound experience for the community, great loss, but you know, at the same time, there's resilience. And we saw that, you know, the high school got built very, very quickly, and at the same time, we also built the Canoe Cultural Center, the first cultural center of its kind in the Canadian Arctic. This is a shot from an elevated standpoint of the building under construction. You'll see the completed building. It was opened in September of 2018, so last year. Now, going back a bit into time, this is again a photograph from the 50s. The person that you see in front of the doorway is Terry Ryan. And Terry Ryan is the longtime general manager of the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative. I never worked under Terry Ryan. In fact, I only met him twice. He became very, very sick with Parkinson's disease, and so he retired and went into a little bit of a very distant retirement from the activities of the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative. But he was a long time, very, very dedicated and committed, very innovative as well in the way that he managed the cooperative and how the studio grew under his leadership. Now, prior to Terry Ryan, and for a relatively short period of time, was James Houston. And I mentioned his name earlier. The government of Canada sent James on an exploratory mission to determine what kind of economy could exist in Cape Dorset. And this is a very famous photograph, always with a cigarette, James Houston. And there, in fact, is a very, it's a famous story. We're not sure if it's true, because James was, at his heart, a marketer. So often his stories told this amazing history of Cape Dorset, and then we found out not a lot of it was true, but it sounded good. Anyway, the story that
Yeah, well, could you tell your story?
the story that we've heard, printmaking, the birth of printmaking in Dorset, I don't know if you heard this one, where he was smoking a cigarette, and one of the Inuit guys in the community picked up his packet of cigarettes, this paper packet of cigarettes, and of course it was adorned with, you know, something, a sailor or whatever. And the guy said, oh boy, it must have taken so long to draw all of these, you know, packages. He said, no, we don't draw them. They're actually made in a printing process. So he's trying to explain printing, and this Inuit guy's like, I don't know what you're talking about. I've never heard of printing before. So he took, I think, a piece of paper, laid it onto something that had a pattern, and he rubbed it with a graphite pencil. And the Inuit guy looked at it and said, oh, we could do that. So if you believe the story, that would be the birth of printmaking.
Right, no, I actually have heard the story. And also from his wife, Alma, whom we met in Nova Scotia. They received one time a watch out of stone, made perfectly. And that was when, this is what I heard too, when he realized how talented these people were. Now, why would an Inuit person make a watch? Because they don't really, at that time anyways, in the 50s, they never wore one. And they had observed that all the white people were wearing watches, so it must be a very important object. Therefore, they made the watch, thinking that it had a great value. And this is another reason that James thought these people were so observant and were then able to transfer their observations into an object.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And this is what is at the heart of why this has been such a sophisticated and successful operation since its beginnings. And here's an example. This is James Houston, you know, observing someone who had just finished creating, and we talked about it earlier, a stone cut. So this is a piece of locally quarried stone. They've taken it, they've carved out an image. That image will be inked with a brayer, and it will be transferred to a piece of paper. And if you notice the background, there's work on the walls that they're probably proofing. This is the first printing press, which is still in Cape Dorset. That would have been brought on a pallet, on a freighter, you know. So all of these things had to be introduced to Cape Dorset, and people had to be trained how to use them. You can imagine how complex printmaking for us. It's alchemy in a lot of ways. And we've created master printers generation after generation after generation. And the studios, even in the very beginning, we'll see images of the new studios in the Canoe Cultural Center. Even in the very beginning, these studios were very sophisticated for the Arctic. You wouldn't imagine that these things could exist in a place so distant. And the process, in addition to stone cut, lithography and etching take place in the studios. And there you see someone transferring the ink from the stone to the Japanese paper. And they're pulling the print. Again, a shot of the studio. You see some of the works, and some of these works that are on the walls became very famous prints. These would have been, again, when they're being proofed by the printers. And this is interesting. This room no longer, it's now been decommissioned, but when it was operational up until middle of 2018, this wasn't the lithography studio. This was, in fact, the break room. And so there's 4 windows, and we have 4 senior printmakers. And at break, which happens at 10:30 and 4 o'clock every day, they would grab their coffee, and each of them would sit in front of one of the windows, and they would stare out into the landscape. And one said to me, you know, this is why we do this. I said, why? And he goes, because we do it for Cape Dorset.
Yeah. Also, question. Now, normally people submit drawings, and that would be, who decides which drawing would be used or chosen to have the stone cut?
It's a very good question, and to your point earlier about the Japanese model, this is a Japanese model where a master printmaker works with an artist. The artist produces a drawing, the master printmaker negotiates through the printing process in order to make something that the artist is pleased with and is authentic to the original expression. The selection process, we have a studio manager who is ultimately responsible for the entire operation. This is William Ritchie, who's been doing this for many years. However, he works in concert with the master printmakers, and so they will put a number of prints or drawings onto a table, and they all kind of assess, well, what would this look like in lithograph? Well, it wouldn't be a good lithograph. It might be an amazing etching, or that is definitely a stone cut. Other times the drawing is just, it's not amenable to being translated into print. So a lot of those decisions are based on, how well the work will translate, but also how compelling the drawing is to begin with.
Decision in a group.
Decision in a group.
Yeah.
And it's mentorship as well, bringing the group through, having the younger printmakers, part of that process to understand how you make those visual decisions. So this is an example of one of the older expressions, and this a stencil, and it's probably sealskin, and looks like what you might expect Inuit art to look like. It's a snapshot of what would have been, traditional life, and you've got a polar bear, and it's very funny because I never thought that I would have to abide by polar bear warnings in my job. And of course, I'm about to leave my apartment, and someone in a car pulls up and says, "No, go back in, polar bear, polar bear." Oh boy, so this does happen. Now this is a little more recent, I think 1976 might have been, I can't remember the exact date. This is again Canoe Ashevak, it's Enchanted Owl. If people know Inuit art, they generally know this print. An interesting fact about this print, I think it was probably about a month and a half ago, 2 months ago, it went on auction in Canada, and 216,000 Canadian dollars, the most that a print has ever achieved at auction.
November, yeah.
How big is it?
How big?
50, no, it's bigger than that. It's 50 times 60 or something like that, or maybe 80. Yeah, but this is only a proof that the real one, the one on the stamp is a beautiful red black. Yeah, no.
And I do have the luxury when someone comes into the office, and it's usually an art enthusiast, say, "Oh, I've never seen a enchanted owl up close," and then I'll just go into our printer's proof drawer and take out 1, 2, 3. So it is a luxury.
Yeah.
Now, so these are the expressions that we kind of know and are traditional and what people associate with Inuit art. And we have a new generation of artists working now, and this is Shania Shuna, who, if you ever have the opportunity to come to the North, she is somebody that you have to meet. She is a delight, so gentle, but obviously when you see the work, you can tell there's something going on in that personality that's very, very different from what you and I understand. And this is a typical example of the way that she depicts the human figure. And she does capture a lot of the landscape in a very unique way. She captures life in Dorset, as you can see the bottom half of that drawing, someone with a harpoon, and then this happens. And there are monsters, and there are octopus giving birth to humans and vice versa, and there are carrots in the sand, and there is rocks and little things that look like globes. Very nightmarish. So totally fantastical, and what you wouldn't assume is produced in Inuit art from Cape Dorset. And so there I am with Shuvani. She's explaining one of her works. And I think, and these were pieces that we released, these lithographs. And I think you have these.
We have these, yes. We have these. We actually bought 2 sets of these, thinking that if somebody liked ours, that we're going to exhibit at some point so much that that we would have one available for sale. I just absolutely love these images. It's multiples of the same, I believe, is the title. Yeah, there's absolutely fantastic. The clam, or the quahog, actually is one of my favorites.
And again, a very important step for Shuvani, because she's not exhibited as an Inuit artist. She's exhibited as a contemporary artist who is of Inuit heritage. And so this means the discourse reshapes and shifts a lot. Particularly under the auspices of an institution like the power plant in Toronto.
now the power plant is really an iconic place to have a contemporary exhibition. They're very, very selective, I must say. But maybe I could also mention what you put together at the Venice Biennale with Kanaginaut Putuguk. That was absolutely fantastic 3 years ago now.
3 years now.
Yeah, it was just so incredible to see Kanaginaut Putuguk's prints with the other contemporary artists. It was, I wouldn't say it was a seamless continuation of the exhibition, but it really stood out amazingly well. And so this year, actually, it'll be Asuma Productions who will be present at the Biennale. Yeah.
It was a remarkable experience because, you know, when you're dealing with the Venice Biennale, one needs to be nervous at the best of times. And I think when we were introducing the first Inuit artist into a Biennale program, Venice Biennale program, we didn't know what to expect. And it was overwhelming, the response that we received. In fact, from Paris, I flew to from Venice, I flew to Paris, and when I got to Paris, hit the ground, suddenly Figaro has one image of Kananganak on the cover. The next day, another image of Kananganak appeared in Figaro. Like, it was crazy, you know, how much of a response and how resonant the work was. And this was work from somebody who died a decade earlier.
Yeah.
You know, so of course we're getting all these, we manage a lot of public relations for artists, and getting phone calls saying, oh, I must interview Kananganak. Well, you're 10 years too late. So, but enjoy his work, certainly.
But he was here in 2000 with us. Right. Yeah. He was a fantastic person. And our son did a workshop with him, actually. Yeah.
Well, and it's interesting because I talk about that community spirit in Cape Dorset, and amongst the artists, it's very, very evident. So artists talk to each other, artists work in the studio together, and so this is an example, as we transition from Shania Shuna, you see Shania in the glasses, to the person she's with is Ningyakula TV, who is another one of our growing in popularity artists. And her work is certainly different from Shubinai's in that it does have a clear reference to the traditional. This is, of course, an owl, and you see that the clothing that the owl is wearing, a pair of traditional kamiks. Well, then you think, oh, the owl is wearing traditional human kamiks. The eyes are stylized. She has, you'll see the ends of the what seem to be fingers are actually a feather motif. And so what I find fascinating about her work is that she uses the same sorts of motif, but it reinvents them in each of her works. So she's very consistent how she approaches things. And here's a raven in Amauti. And there is a polar bear, and you see at the very, very top was a tiny, tiny person on top of the polar bear. So again, it does, and what I also find fascinating about this is if you look where the skyline is, it's that tiny little strip of blue across the top. So these bizarre croppings, this strange scale. Now,
human dimension in the Arctic.
It's true.
Yeah.
I often feel that way.
Yeah.
Now, this is one of our youngest artists, and it's Ulusi Saila is her name, and she's holding up one of her drawings. This was 2 summers ago. And this was probably, I would say, a handful of drawings she created. This may have been her 8th drawing, let's say. So you can imagine, like, this highly stylized. What we saw in the first couple of drawings, we didn't know what was happening. And then suddenly the language just emerged. And she heavily applies the pencil crayon to the paper. In fact, it's remarkable. I have to convince curators it's actually pencil crayon because it's got to be some kind of specialized material that she's created. No, it's pencil crayon used in a very interesting way. And I wanted to, if you look at the element in the middle, that's actually a snow-covered rock outcrop. People say, well, what does that mean? Well, there it is right there. So you see how she's captured the landscape in a highly unique way. And then you see these sorts of things. And when you go to Dorset and you see, or the north in general, and you see the landscape, suddenly this is what you see. You know, this moment where the sky has bizarre colorations and, you know, the water has these moments of reflection and the bizarre varied colorings of the rock. It's quite incredible. So you see where the artists have been reflecting on the landscape and things happening around them. Then you've got Shubinai who delves deep into a psyche, you know, to pull out these monsters and these strange mythical creatures. This is a collection of work from an artist, Padlu Samueli, and you'll see that there's a tractor next to a water tank, and there's a boat, or I think it's a boat, and the middle one, a duck, and some landscape. And then you get a skyscraper. And interestingly, Padlu and I spent 2 weeks in Brooklyn. We have an arrangement with the Brooklyn Museum, and it's a 2-week research residency for an artist from Cape Dorset. And so the idea is the artist doesn't make work. The artist just learns about what the Brooklyn Museum does, what an institution does. And, because of course they don't exist in the same way in the north. And they also experience the city. So Padlu, after drawing all of these very architectural representations of the community that she lives in, suddenly she's in New York. And we started to see skyscrapers and towers and construction cranes and all of the stuff that she remembers from New York. And she took, I think, on her iPad, she took about 690 images that she brought back to Cape Dorset. And so we're suddenly amazing. We call it the New York Suite. She was creating these amazing, amazing pieces. And so you see where the artists can adapt to the material that's around them. And at one point, I had a curator who said, this work does not look Inuit at all. What are you doing to these people? And I said, well, let me oh God, I should check with, somebody about this. I should talk to an artist. And I called up Padlu, and I said, Padlu, you're making these skyscrapers. People said it's not Inuit art anymore. And she goes, I am an Inuk artist. It's Inuit art. I said, okay, there we go.
Oh, that reminds me of years ago, especially the 70s, where Western critics were trying to put this art in a box. And no, you cannot use, you can't use clay. I'm thinking of Rankin Inlet and the clay things that they were doing. And it's, Inuit can't use clay. And it's like, who is this person trying to tell an artist what material he or she should be using? I mean, this is art, and they should be able to use any medium that they want. And yeah, this is a perfect example of how some people are stuck in the past. Yeah.
It's interesting. Speaking of, artists should be able to do what they want. This is a shot of we do a Sculptors Form once a year. So I bring all the sculptors together. And what do you need? Do you need new tools? Do you need better rock? Do you, of course, because predominantly the sculptors use rock as their medium. And so I brought these guys together and I said, so what is it now? And one of them stands up and he starts yelling at me in Inuktitut. And the translator said, he just said they want to stop making these dancing bears. And I thought, okay, this is interesting because the dancing bear has been a staple of Inuit art for, since the beginning. And so look, this is some dancing bears, some walking bears, some dancing rabbits, all of these things. And I said, well, what do you really want to make? And they kept saying, well, we want to do more stuff like Sam Tunu does. I said, sure, that's kind of cool, because all these curators really are contemporary curators are really into this iconography. It's like, it pushes the boundaries. It takes traditional carving practice, traditional media in the north, and does something completely different. And these are really macabre, but very compelling pieces. And then one of the youngest kids sitting at the end of the row, and he puts his hand up meekly. He goes, if I could show you something that I've been working on, I don't want to show everybody else because I don't know if it's good. And so he arrives with this, a Harley Davidson with chrome detail made out of serpentine stone. And I said, no, you need to put this in the middle of the room, and we all need to look at it. And so you imagine, and this kid's like, and suddenly we have now this production of Harleys coming in. It's quite amazing. So that's sort of what goes on in Cape Dorset. There's a lot more that happens up there, but we've only got limited time. And I just wanted to touch on, because as you mentioned, Martha, I'm between Cape Dorset and Toronto, and so our office is in Toronto. This is an example of the showroom that we use to display the sculpture. And we predominantly work with commercial galleries. The work is there to be consigned, or gallerists will come to us, they'll select an exhibition from what we have, and then they will sell to the collector. We don't generally engage with the end user, as we call it. We do work with museums. We work with, private institutions like this one in order to make sure that the work has the right home. And so we do a lot of research, to find out where the work that we're working with at the time should go. We have a library. This is probably the most complete Inuit library on the planet. And you can imagine, what does that say about Inuit art and scholarship? This is a tiny little library. And most of these books have maybe one reference to an Inuit artist, and the rest of it is artists from elsewhere. So one of the things that we've instituted is a residency program for young writers. And so we have a writer or two each year. And the obligation is that they must be part of a program, whether it's art history or literature, and they must write something about Inuit art that we bring into the library. And that way we continue the discussion and the discourse around this work. And sometimes we'll get these very, very smart, but they'll come in with a thing and they'll say, I'm really sorry, it's kind of critical about the situation. I said, you know what? That's exactly what we want. We want that kind of discourse. We want to see, should we be doing things differently, better? Are there different ways that we should be doing things? And so this is a very important part of what we do as an organization. So you saw that where the sculptural pieces are, this is just, if you can imagine, just drawers and drawers and drawers and drawers of works on paper. We estimate that we have 35,000 works on paper in the building at any given time. The studios in Cape Dorset have about 25,000 images, and we have a museum just outside of Toronto, the McMichael Canadian Art Collection. They have 100,000 works on paper from our collection, so it's a lot of stuff.
Are there duplicates in these, or we're talking about that many separate images?
Sometimes in the print realm, yes, there are duplicates. We have multiple copies of prints, but for the most part, they're drawings.
Drawings, yeah. Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, at the McMichael, the early drawings, I sort of arrived at the McMichael to give me something that's totally wacky, just as an example of what's in the collection. And it was a piece of paper, and there was a little sun on it, and there was a smiley face, and something else, and this was from the 50s. I said, why are we keeping this? And it's a doodle. I said, if you can imagine, this would have been the moment when you gave somebody who lived in an igloo on the land a graphite pencil and said, you can make art with this. And then had to realize, oh wait, you don't know how to use a pencil. So this is the early stages of mark making, only in the 50s, but still the early stages of mark making within Inuit.
Yeah, maybe we should, just after World War II, backtracking a little bit. Prior to World War II, the Inuit were nomads, so that's why nobody had a pencil. They did have a language and all, but the art was used normally for everyday use, for carvings or for exchange goods from the earlier seafarers and that kind of thing. So it was after World War II, when they were forced to become sedentary, that they needed some kind of occupation. And as we were talking about James Houston, he realized the talent that these people had. But it was a big transfer, a big transfer.
Absolutely.
Perfectly done.
And it's just a bit of an example, it's an example of this is our shipping receiving area at any given time in Toronto, and you imagine how much we ship when you see the volume of work that we deal with. And I always think it's such an impossible task, and I think we're probably a preferred customer of every cargo agency because we ship rock. So you can imagine how expensive this is to get this work into the world. So it is amazing for me how this work is created in Cape Dorset. It comes to our offices in Toronto and gets scattered across the world. I want to sort of move into, and I think we're nearing the end, and then I'd love to hear from you guys. But we just opened, as I mentioned a little earlier, the Canoe Cultural Center in Cape Dorset in September. I think the community opening was September 5th, and the dignitary opening was September 8th of 2018, so mere months ago. If you can imagine, this is the first time in Cape Dorset that a facility has existed where artists can see their own work in a gallery situation. And it's also the first time that there's been a major upgrade to the printing facilities. So when I first walked into the space and the studios were up and running, all of the artists were there, and they were just smiling. I said, "What? You seem to be grinning." And they said, "Well, look at this place. Of course we're grinning." So it was a remarkable, remarkable addition to the community, a great development for the artists who use the facility. This is the front desk. It looks like a front desk in any facility anywhere. This is a shot of the gallery space in process. We were trying out what potential installations could look like. The walls move, which is, again, a remarkable prospect in the Arctic. It has a surround sound system. It's just remarkable for me to know that this kind of technology exists. This is a small installation in one of the anteroom galleries, and this, again, is the first time artists can make a drawing, have it put up onto the wall, and stand there with their colleague artists and talk about what they just did. You know, what are some of the interesting things in the new drawings? You know, how can they look at their work coming together? Could they collaborate on something? These are all discussions that can now happen in this space. And this is a shot of the corridor that separates the public space, which is the gallery space we just saw, and the studio space, which is what you see here. Proper ventilation, proper lighting, surrounded by windows. And once again, as I mentioned to you, those printmakers that when they take their break, they stare out at the land to remind them, you know, that they're doing this for Cape Dorset. You can see Cape Dorset wherever you are in the building now, which makes it a remarkable, remarkable reminder, again, where you are and why you do this. Again, you see these amazing facilities. This I'd like to show. This is the level of public and private sector that went into this building. It was close to $13.5 million in order to realize this space. This is a shot. The one with the microphone is we hired a general manager for the cultural center, so she is speaking to a crowd. We estimated 500 people from the community showed up. There's 1,400 people in the community. That's a lot of people. That's a successful opening, I think. And at one point during the afternoon, I got a phone call on my cell, and someone said, I can't get into the building. There's just a lineup. I said, a lineup into the building? I hadn't noticed what was going on around me. I said, I'll open the back door for you. I opened up the door, and this is the lineup of people waiting to get in to see this new facility.
I love the younger faces. Huh? It's really fantastic how the younger people are so engaged then as well.
And this is the exhibition that's currently on until, I think, the 31st of March. And these are drawings that were chosen to be prints. So once, as Martha pointed out, once a drawing is chosen to become a print, the drawing is never sold. It's never given to a museum. It's retained by the organization in the archives. So many of these drawings, when we reviewed the exhibition, had never been seen before. This exhibition will travel across Canada to 10 locations starting 2020. And it's the first time an exhibition's been generated at an Arctic facility that then has a national tour across Canada. So this is kind of a remarkable moment. To accompany that show, we had an exhibition of sculpture from the permanent collection of the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative. And this is the final slide, and I like this one because it just reminds me, and I see this view often when I'm there, it just reminds me with this new building, you know, this history, this 60-year history of Inuit art now has the next step is, I think, this building, and I don't know, you know, what this means in terms of the next anniversary, but I think there are lots of exciting things happening. The industry that sustains the community is art and the art market. There is government, mostly government, whether it's government of Nunavut, territory of Nunavut, or the local government that hires for school teaching and, you know, administration, maintenance, those things. But if you imagine, you have 25% of the population is involved somehow in sort of art making or art distribution or art production or art, you know, promotion. But 75% of the population is reliant on the art market. So it means you have one artist that, you know, is generated by a very, you know, a portion of very successful artists, you know, who now, you know, get back to the community to ensure that they're healthy. You have a handful of Southerners that work at the studio, but the majority of the employees for the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative are of Inuit heritage. Transplants from the south that go to Cape Dorset, in just, again, I wouldn't know numbers off the top of my head, and I'd have to actually verify it. But in my experience, you know, most of the Northerners who are in Dorset are from Cape Dorset, which is really interesting, you know. And often they've gone to Iqaluit to school, and they do feel compelled to come back to Cape Dorset. Now, that is changing, as we've talked about, you know, you and I, where you have people, you know, young people realizing that there are opportunities elsewhere and suddenly disappear from their home communities. And you know, one of the things that we'd like to be able to do, and the Cultural Center, I think, is a good example of that, if we can create possibilities that exist in the same way there as they do in the South, there's more, we hope, more of a chance that people will stay in Cape Dorset as opposed to seeking those opportunities elsewhere. So it's about creating a circumstance that compels people to stay, travel, but please come back is what we'd like to see.
Health.
Health. Well, I mean, this is a big issue. I mean, as is food security. You know, all kinds of things that we take, you know, as commonplace in the communities in the South and around the world. You can't in Cape Dorset. And one of the things that, just to give you an example of a very salient incident for us, Tim Pitzulak, one of our, you know, a brilliant artist, an amazing personality, one of our ambassadors. He was somebody I relied on all the time to be able to represent Cape Dorset in a number of circumstances, public speaking, on air with the media and the press. So Tim wasn't feeling very well. He was a hunter. So I go hunting, I'm not feeling well, I'm either exhausted, maybe I have a cold. He got sicker and sicker and sicker. Finally, you know, he goes to the health center. They said, "Oh my God, you have pneumonia." So they put him onto a plane, and he was rerouted for weather to another community. He was grounded in another community with even less infrastructure around healthcare. He got to Iqaluit and he died. Somebody who was, I think, 48, 49 years old, who dies of pneumonia in 2017, I think, is when he, you know, and who doesn't have access to the kind of medicine that we all should have access to? The North. You know, and it's an issue. I went before, you said, the Senate committee, and I do this quite frequently in Ottawa, and it is absolutely 100% my job now, although it seems odd that I'm an arts administrator advocating for better healthcare, better nutrition, you know, better infrastructure in the North. But in order to keep the community happy and to keep our artists healthy, you know, these are really important discussions that need to happen. And if there is nobody at the government level advocating for this, who is going to do it? Well, the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative has to. And so, I mean, I've just seen circumstances that should never happen. You know, people who are, you know, with a minor mental health issue that is easily worked through with the infrastructure and the counseling that we all have access to, they're completely undiagnosed, completely untreated, turns into a major problem. You know, so it's interesting for me to have to kind of navigate a lot of these areas. I'm not an expert in you know, the area of health. I've become better acquainted with it as a result of this job. You know, the judicial system is another one. And, you know, we have artists who simply did something very stupid as a youth and have a record, a conviction, which means they can't travel outside of the country. And, you know, you'd think, well, I guess they just can't vacation in Florida, but they also can't do a master class at a printmaking studio in the United States or Europe. So it impedes professional development for these artists who have huge potential. So for us, in order to, you know, how do you keep this community sustained? How do you make sure that there is professional development? How do you make sure that mentorship continues? I have to become better acquainted with how we can suspend convictions, you know, and again, this is not an area of expertise that a little arts administrator like myself, you know, really knows about, but it's one that's become exceedingly important for us to address in order for us to keep to sustain what has been the momentums for the past 60 years. The co-op has managed the careers of the artists from Cape Dorset. We've managed them in a particular way. And that's been consistent over the course of 60 years, with some amendments and changes, but largely the same. We hear this from our artists. You know, I want to do something different. I don't know whether I want to be associated with the way that the co-op works. And so for us, you know, the dilemma is, do we try to be consistent, or do we think about how we shift our culture in order to accommodate that? And so I think you're absolutely right. This is a really interesting, you know, time. And I think the developments, particularly for Nunavut's been, because it's such a recent territory, I think that's also the issue. People were grappling with, you know, its citizens are still grappling with being independent from the Northwest Territories. So I think that once that kind of stability, is maintained, that's when people can start thinking creatively about, wait a minute, I want to be part of this movement, not this movement. So it's just very interesting comment.
We, who's we? Who's we? We, yeah, from the West Baffin. I think we have to emphasize that, who the we is, actually.
Well, you mean in terms of structurally who we are.
Yeah.
So yes, it's an interesting, so I have a boss, a general manager of the West Baffin Eskimo Cooperative, and he's based in Cape Dorset. He also manages a team my colleagues in Cape Dorset. We have a studio manager, we have an assistant studio manager, we have master printmakers, and we have our artists. There's also an administration team that works to support the studio operations. We also manage, if you can imagine, we have diesel delivery, and we have a retail operation, so a hardware store and a grocery store, and we have rental properties. So the rental properties, diesel, and the retail operations offset any fluctuations in the art market. And you can imagine the art market, anyway, I think you all have some connection to the art market, you know how fickle it can be. So the model was meant to sustain the art production and the art distribution, even when there was a lull in the marketplace. And so that means that the other operations offset any kind of deficiencies in the art side of things. Then the Toronto operation, we have, it's a quite large space that we have in downtown Toronto. You saw some of the images on the screen. And at that operation, we have 5, including myself. And we've got a specialist in sculpture, a specialist in works on paper. We have a copyright manager, and it's kind of unique because you imagine, we've had the enchanted owl that you saw on the screen has been reproduced 1 billion times. I'm not exaggerating. And on stamps, we have Canoe on Canadian currency. So you imagine how difficult it is to navigate the reproduction of these things in various different formats. So we have somebody specialized in that. We have a restoration artist. So the stone that arrives from Dorset, often there are problems because it is stone, and shipping and receiving is not as delicate as you'd like them to be. And so we have somebody who can restore those objects if they need to be restored. And then me, who is responsible for engaging internationally, working with governments and marketing, communications, special projects, all of those things. So it's a relatively speaking, a sophisticated operation. And we're the only one, I think, that has a co-op operation in the north and a satellite operation in an urban center like Toronto.
Right. Yeah, Inuit owned and operated.
Inuit owned, 100% Inuit owned, and our board of directors is 100% Inuit. When I present reports to the board of directors, I present in English, and the translator does it in Nunavut, and vice versa. And so it's truly a northern experience for me when I have to go up and do my, this is what I did this quarter report. So it's pretty remarkable.
There's a wonderful book, the biography of artists from Cape Dorset, done by Kira Fisher, and it's really great described, as to who the parents were, who maybe the adopted parents were, which is another thing, that if a child would show talent and isn't living with the artist's family, the child would be adopted out so that this talent could be developed in the other family. It's but a child always knows the mother, real mother and real fathers are. I mean, I just think of my daughter who has parents in Moscow who looked after her when she was doing her university studies, and I say that I'm related to her Russian mother, So it's really that kind of feeling, where the child comes first, to develop its talents is really, really important in the community. Yeah.
That's very true.
Yeah. I hope that we will be able to continue giving them lots of opportunities to show their wonderful, wonderful works to a wonderful audience. Thank you all for coming. Yeah.
Thank you.